The year is 1927. All of Europe has been ravaged by tuberculosis, and there is no cure in sight. Desperate for some control, homes are opened for the victims of the disease. These places had two purposes. Firstly, it would separate the infected from the healthy, and hopefully prevent further spread. Secondly, they served as final resting places, a retreat from society for the few months the victim had to live. These places provided some semblance of peace not just to the victims, but their loved ones too, who would be spared seeing them during the worst of the unforgiving illness. One such place was Panagia Soulakiotis, or the Convent of the Virgin in the Pines in a small town in rural Greece. Placed in the high mountaintops, this monastery promised to be a place of spiritual healing and opens its doors, welcoming the sick with open arms. But something's wrong. Too many people are dying, and a lot quicker than they should. Obviously, death is to be expected at a place like this. But the numbers don't match up, and people who had no signs of the sickness are being recorded as dead. Strange reports are coming through. The monastery is not what it seems, and people are demanding investigation. In the middle of the night, on the 4th of December 1950, 85 police officers forced their way into the monastery, and what they found was more horrible than anything they could have ever imagined. Several half-naked and malnourished elderly women are discovered in the basement, where they had been tied up and tortured for months. Also rescued are 35 starving children who had to be pried away from their captors. Who could have done this? And how did they manage to get away with it for so long? Mariam Soulakiotis was born in 1883 to a relatively poor family. They made their living by taking care of a small farm. With little choice to do anything else, Mariam, or Marina, as she was called at the time, joined the family business and helped on their small property. But Marina dreamed of being much more. She wanted power, wealth, and she knew she couldn't get any of this if she stayed at home. So, she goes somewhere she can garner power without needing an education or any money to speak of. She becomes a nun. The act of becoming a nun is usually seen as a selfless act, but this was not the case for Mariam. Mariam joined the Old Calendarist Church at a hectic time. There was talk about the Greek church splitting into factions, and when it did, Mariam saw opportunity. The head monk of the church at the time was a man named Matthew Karpathakis. He had been harboring doubts about the church for a while. He thought its teachings were outdated and in dire need of changing. Since it wasn't possible to change the teaching, however, he decided to leave the Old Calendarists and start a new faction, aptly called the New Calendarist Church. Joining him in this endeavor was none other than Mariam Soulakiotis, who had garnered a close relationship to Matthew. In order to ground their new faction, they needed a place for people to pray. So, in 1927, they opened the infamous Panagia Soulakiotis, or the Convent of the Virgin in the Pines. To this day, no one knows how the duo were able to secure enough land for the building of the monastery, but it's safe to assume that it wasn't through legal ways. Mariam proved to be a very powerful ally. Her charisma and the thought of a shiny new monastery garnered many followers for the New Calendarist Church. She was trusted and well-liked in the community, a fact that would soon prove to be fatal. As mentioned, the convent doubled as a rest home for patients of tuberculosis. This would give Mariam the perfect cover for her crimes. Less easy to hide, however, were the deaths of the nuns. Because you see, among the new followers, Mariam had also inspired young women to join the monastery as nuns. After a while, however, the young bright novices would start dying untimely deaths. Looking back on it now, their deaths had an obvious motive. The nuns would have seen Mariam torturing and killing patients, and Mariam was not one to leave loose ends. Her method of murder is unclear, but most evidence points to the use of poison. So, what were Mariam's crimes on the patients? Well, her torture was well thought out. She firstly made use of psychological manipulation to trap people in the monastery in the first place. One method of doing this was by finding wealthy religious families and promising them salvation, and as payment, asked for their daughters' dowries. This way, she traps them financially, leeching money off them without them even realizing what's happening. If they resisted this trap, she would physically kidnap them, confine them to a cellar, and torture them until they gave her what she wanted. The torture would be so extreme that the families would sometimes perish. In this case, Mariam would excuse the bodies as being a few of the many tuberculosis corpses that were being carted out of the monastery daily. Terrifyingly, because of this deception, the identity, or even the exact number of Mariam's victims, is something that remains unknown to this day. Another thing that helped Mariam get away with her crimes for so long was the position of the monastery. Built on top of a mountain, with thick walls, in the middle of nowhere, her victims' screams would go unheard. As mentioned previously, Mariam was also violent towards the nuns that had been placed under her rule and care. She kept them in line with beatings, and eventually, some of the nuns would even develop Stockholm Syndrome, gladly helping Mariam cover up her crimes. Mariam's power was so absolute that she is now referred to as Mother Rasputin. In order to further throw off suspicion, Mariam would outsource her victims by advertising the monastery of supposed healing in other parts of Greece. This also encouraged donations, which all went, of course, straight into Mariam's pockets. It was this act that would finally draw the police's attention to the murderous abbess. A tip to the police revealed that an elderly woman had transferred all her assets to the monastery, a move her daughter was convinced could only have been made under duress. This suspicion alone wasn't sufficient to detain Mariam, prompting authorities to probe into her unexplained affluence. Their investigation unveiled her involvement in the illicit trading of olive oil and spices. But these accusations of illegal trading were not enough to apprehend someone of Mariam's stature. These investigations were enough to make the family members of the many victims suspicious of Mariam. They demanded that the police search further. And indeed, when the police finally got access to the monastery, the evidence was more than enough to finally capture Mariam. The records of her arrest show that she had had almost 300 total properties in her name. The stolen wealth was also comprised of gold and jewels, worth a small fortune. By the time of her arrest, Mariam had already accumulated a cult following. In order to stop these people from continuing in Mariam's footsteps, they outlawed groupings of so-called Matthewites just a year after her arrest in 1950. Eventually, the entirety of the old Calendarist church was dismantled. This would prove vital to secure a conviction. As previously, Mariam could have gotten her way out of jail time through a loophole that would protect her crimes as religious, and thus requiring investigation not of Mariam, but as the system as a whole, potentially freeing her from justice. Until the very end, Mariam denied all the allegations, and the Greek Orthodox Church never acknowledged her trial. Because of this, the trial went on for a few years, and when it eventually did end and her conviction was finalized, she would die a few months later. I guess she found a loophole out of jail after all. At the time of her death, Mariam Soulakiotis was 71 years old. She was not the only person imprisoned, as a few nuns and Matthew himself were also found guilty. But it was abundantly clear that Mariam had been the criminal mastermind. Her followers remained present until years after her death. They kept donating money to the monastery, which remains standing to this day. One can only imagine the extent of the horrors that stained the walls with innocent blood. Mariam's legacy remains as a dark stain on the pages of the history of the Greek Church. There have been many Greek authors that have tried to write an account of Mariam's legacy, attempts to bring closure after so much tragedy. As we come to the close of our exploration of Mariam Soulakiotis' life, we are left to ponder the depths of human depravity and the resilience of the human spirit in the face of such darkness. The story of the Panagia Pevkovanogia monastery under her rule serves as a stark reminder of the potential for harm when power is abused, and a call to remain vigilant against the forces of manipulation and control, no matter the guise under which they appear.